On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, a communique after the Central Committee's 4th plenary session wrapped up, the top of the agenda, and despite an APEC meeting setback, a tipping point in efforts to hammer out a China-U.S. trade deal? And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin with an important political event for the Chinese Communist Party, the 4th plenary session of the party's 19th Central Committee, which wrapped up in Beijing on Thursday with the release of a communique. The session honed in some major issues, such as how to maintain and improve the system of socialism with Chinese characteristics. They also sought to advance the modernization of China's system and capacity for governance. Before we loop in our panelists about exactly what is the outcome of this session, let's take a look at this.
The Communist Party of China just wrapped up a key meeting. The 19th Central Committee of the CPC concluded its 4th plenary session and released a communique, which read, "The system of socialism with Chinese characteristics is a scientific system developed by the party and the people through their long-term practices and explorations." Speaking of overall goals to be met, the session vowed to see that institutions in all fields were notably improved when the CPC marks its centenary. They worked out a way for the modernization of China's system and capacity for governance, which is set to be achieved by 2035. At that time, it's expected to be realized in full as the People's Republic of China celebrates its 100th anniversary. The session fully affirmed the work of the Political Bureau of the CPC Central Committee since the 3rd plenary session held last February. Usually, there are 7 plenary sessions during a 5-year tenure. They are often on fixed topics. The first focuses on the party's major personnel assignment. In 2017, Xi Jinping was re-elected General Secretary. In the 2nd session, members proposed a list of candidates for government leadership. The 3rd, on making major decisions on the future course of the country. And the 4th is generally on party building. The 5th introduces the next 5-year plan for social and economic development. The 6th, on a fixed agenda such as public spirit and cultural reforms. The 7th and final session reviews the party work report and prepares for the next Congress. Those plenary sessions are crucial political gatherings and of historic significance for China's path to development.
For more on the 4th plenary session, let's turn to our panelists in Berlin, Germany. We are joined by Dr. Wolfram Adolphi, who is from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. He is a sinologist, has done research about Chinese politics and CPC for almost 40 years. In Beijing, we have Professor Fu Jun, an academic dean of the Institute for South-South Cooperation and Development of Peking University. Last but not least, Einar Kangen, our current affairs commentator. Welcome, gentlemen, to our program. May I start by asking Professor Fu, now we have noticed in the communique some special phrases that did not appear before in the early communiques of the 19th Party Congress. For example, strategic planning, the emphasis on that, and also strategic certainties. Now, I'm translating that directly from the Chinese to English, but what exactly, on the very top paragraphs of the communique, do all of these phrases say about what China is facing right now?
Well, when you look forward, see a longer time horizon, and you see uncertainties arising, your plan should be more forward-looking, more long-term. And when Chinese say strategic, usually you have that meaning. It's my take. And a short-term forward doing is they say, okay, we do some policies and the tactics. So in this sense, when you are talking about the 100th anniversary of the founding of the party and the second 100 years of the PRC, so you really have a sense of long-term planning.
Well, there is a phrase in the top paragraphs, Dr. Adolphi, if I could. I'm not sure whether you have already read the Chinese version or the English translation of the Chinese version yet, because it just came out earlier, a few hours ago. They talk about two priorities for the Chinese Communist Party. One is development, which we have seen over and over again. However, the other is security, 发展与安全. Now, those two words are not necessarily appearing all at the same time in the same paragraph in the same sentence. So, Dr. Adolfi, how do you see that, given the international circumstances and also the potential of our world at a critical juncture?
I really appreciate this question because it gives me the chance to speak about that, what it is, expectations from outside. Expectations from outside. China now is such an important country in the world, has such a big and ever-growing weight in the world, that indeed the question of international security and international communication and the organization of the international world, of the cooperation between the different countries and the different parts of the world, is a crucial one. This is really something not absolutely new, but with a growing weight. We here, of course, expect that there is the saying of a harmonious world is a very important one in the world, as you described it, with a lot of turmoils on the different parts. And so I look at this Congress and the results from this point of view.
Okay. May I go to you also, Mr. Kankan? Same question. Development and security.
Well, you have a very hostile international situation right now, and I'm not saying the communique was reflecting what was said by Pence and then followed up by Pompeo earlier today. But, you know, the situation with the trade war, with everything that's happening, China has to take a very long-term view, and I agree with my colleague on this. They're really looking for how they can get through this period, this kind of post-Trump world that we currently live in, where there's so much uncertainty. So at this point, China is going to focus on the long term and just not get too excited about what's happening. I mean, everything seems to be a little bit topsy-turvy these days.
So focusing on the long term, is that the key? But how could you focus on the long term on the basis that every day there's so much drama going on around the world, and China is a big player, as Dr. Adolfi earlier just illustrated, have to deal with this on a daily basis as well?
Well, you see very strong clues coming out of this communique, and there is a lot about institutions in there, and you see different layers of institutions. They are talking about the most fundamental institutions, then basic institutions and important institutions. Now, to give you an example about the most fundamental institution, I guess what's the message they are trying to send out is, well, China will for quite a long time be a socialist country with the Chinese characteristics. That means the Communist Party's role will be very much elevated. And the basic institution is, well, even when you have a marketplace, you are talking about public ownership vis-a-vis private ownership, and the public ownership will for a long time occupy the main role. Then they are talking about important institutions, and there you are talking about the relationship between the party and the government and how to make the government more efficient to carry out the task.
But you haven't answered my question, which is why do you think it is so important to look at the long term while you also have to deal with the dramas and crises going on around the world on a daily basis? How would that happen?
Okay, one side of the dimension was covered by my colleague when you look at the word security. Now, security in China is sort of a combination of both the security and the safety. In Chinese, you have the safety and the security. The expression is the same. The other dimension, of course, is domestic. And you see the rise of tensions between two sets of forces. One is the economy is slowing down, even though it continues to be above 6-point growth rates. The other part is the ever-rising expectations of the people. So to continue to grow, and with a sense of public security, and internationally, of course, you see the tensions between China and the United States. So I see two dimensions of that word, 安全, both safety and security there.
So in other words, you're trying to illustrate domestically, there has to be a sense of safety that needs to be created for all Chinese in a way, whether it's about welfare or their economic life.
That's why the word is development.
Internationally, it is security. You would term it that way, so that it's looking at more strategic and also geopolitical perspective.
It's both.
Okay.
Long
so may I go to you, Dr. Adolfi, about that? Talking about the communique, the governance has been very much emphasized. Now, it talked about the modernization governance capacity of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, it is very abstract, the phrase itself, but what kinds of governance is actually required for a country as big as the second largest economy, a country in the very middle of all of these changes, once again, from your perspective?
Yeah, I'm interested in how the Chinese Communist Party will solve this question. I mean, all countries or states stand before that question, how to come out with the industrial modernization, with the digitalization, with the new organization of the society. And of course, I'm very interested in seeing how the Chinese party
What have you witnessed? Well, of course, it's easier to ask a question, but you know, what have you witnessed? What have you witnessed in terms of China's effort, if there are any, in that regard, sir? Can you maybe be more specific in your answers?
You know, I'm living here in Berlin. I'm living not in Beijing, so I have to look at it from here, and I see the results of more efficiency and a better organization of the society in the international influence, which of course based on this domestic development. I'm not in a position to give any to make any proposals by myself, because I don't dare to speak about a task which has the Communist Party of China for 1.4 billion people. But I appreciate what it happens because in other parts of the world there is no such strategic planning. There is living from day to day with a lot of crisis, and that makes my interest so big in what happens in China.
Mr. Tengen.
Well, frankly, I agree that it is about planning, and that has been China's strong suit. But in order to do that planning, you have to have people who are dedicated to this kind of socialist system. And that means, quite frankly, everything that's been achieved by the party in terms of anti-corruption, also vetting the young party cadres much more carefully. It used to, you could get by in a year or two. Now it takes 2 to 3 years to actually join the party.
One of the things about governance is really about officials' accountability. Now, that is a crucial issue. We also, I'm sure some of you might have take a look at some of the videos released earlier. For example, the Vice Prime Minister of Singapore have been talking about the accountability of the Chinese officials in the Chinese system over the years. That seems to be quite a unique phenomenon compared to, let's just say, the realities of governance elsewhere in the world, at least in some parts of the world. So, Professor Fu, on the one hand, there is the crackdown on corruption within the party. On the other hand, the accountability is one of the crucial issues these days for officials to face right now. So how do you see that as someone who's been working on governance studies for quite some time?
Well, my take of the word governance is a higher level word of a summing up of all institutions. And when you look at the party, and the party will be there to lead, even when you talk about rule of law. And really, it's not the being of rule of law here in China, it's the becoming of rule by law to rule of law. In the process, the Communist Party will continue to lead. And there, in the process, you see a much elevated role of the supervision and the disciplinary organization of the party, because the party is powerful. You somehow need to have some institutions to make sure the party continue to be clean. And with that, the hope is that you'll have more sophisticated checks and the balances of bureaucratic power of the Chinese state, so that when you move from a system now more on the side of rule by law, but hopefully increasingly to a system of rule of law. And again, and when the people here do that, they say rule of law with the Chinese characteristics.
Dr. Adolfi, another thing that we have seen is about the economic discussion. We have seen the earlier sessions of the 19th Party Congress saying, you know, the market play a dominant role in allocating resources. Now, that has been once again emphasized in the communique, even though not at the most obvious place. Dr. Adolfi, if I brief you about that, how do you see the evolution of China's governance style and also the role of the party at the market? It seems to be a very interesting relationship, to say the least.
Indeed, it is a very interesting relationship. And the way China goes in this field shows that there are really two very different systems of market organization in the West and in China. And this makes it that this is the cause of all the trouble we now have. We have this trade war between the United States and China, and we have the tensions between the different economic systems. And this, of course, depends on it. It shows that the Chinese way is economically very efficient, with a lot of problems too. We see that the growth rate cannot be the same as 10 years before. But from my point of view, it shows how that it is an international problem, because if the two systems really decide to fight economically against each other, the whole mankind will lose. So I hope this efficiency and this special look at the economy by the Communist Party of China helps to understand that we need a worldwide cooperation, because a fight between the two systems will not solve the questions, but sharpen the tensions.
Okay. Mr. Tang, now also in the communique, it's been talking about China's role to actively participate in the evolution of international governance system. Now we know what it's about. It's about the UN, it's about WTO, it's about multilateral platforms, it's about interactions among different entities and economies. So following what Dr. Adolfi just mentioned, how is China, do you think, expected to play that active role about international governance?
Okay, so China is following a different path. It's not going to follow what the Europeans and the United States did in terms of creating this kind of colonial system. Their principles are very simply, you do not get involved in the affairs of other countries. That you have.
I'm not sure whether the American or the European scholars would agree with you that you're saying colonial system, but anyway, well, that's a good debate.
Yes, it would be. And
all right.
I think it's quite clear, and I don't think anyone can argue that the East India Company was trying to do good things for the rest of the world. China is in a system where they need to show leadership, but not necessarily dictate it. It's about a consensus model, not a corporate model. So as China moves forward, it has to establish norms and do battle with the U.S., which is trying to withdraw at the same time as undermine the institutions that China now wants to keep.
Establish norms. That's a very interesting point. I'm sure there will be further times for us to discuss all of this and more about international governance. For now, I want to thank the three of you helping us at least to understand parts of the latest development of the Chinese Communist Party through the fourth plenary session of the 19th Party Congress. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Iner Tangen, Fu Jun, and Wolfram Adolfi. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, still to come on our live program. Despite an APEC meeting setback, a tipping point in efforts to hammer out a China-U.S. trade deal, that's up for discussion right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei on CGTN. Let's now turn to the latest on China-U.S. trade. The highly anticipated November meeting the two countries' presidents was suddenly shelved due to the unrest in Chile, where a one trade deal was expected to be reached. On Thursday, U.S. President Donald Trump tweeted that a new location will be announced soon, and, quote, President Xi and President Trump will do signing, end of quote. China's foreign ministry said trade negotiators from both sides had stayed in touch and had made substantial progress. A phone call between top representatives is expected this Friday. Last Sunday, a group of scholars from U.S. and China banded together to offer their alternative intellectual framework for the two countries to resolve a conflict. At least they tried. The proposal's authors and signatories include Nobel laureates, economists, and a few scholars based in China whom we have invited to the program. Take a look. For more on China-U.S. trade, I'm joined in the Beijing studio by Ju Jianzhong, professor at the PPC School of Finance, and also Professor Yao Yang, who is director of the China Center for Economic Research with Peking University. Joining us in Shanghai, we have Jeffrey Lehman, inaugural vice chancellor and also professor of law from NYU Shanghai. What a pleasure to have all of you. One of the important things is that we've seen economists and legal experts working very hard in order to come up with some kind of suggestions for politicians about China-U.S. trade. Professor Yao, what advice at this critical moment you, as a well-known economist, would give?
I think that both countries have to think about the real situation in the two countries, why the trade war has started from the very beginning. Right? On the China side, China is a developing country and is going to be a developing country for quite some time in the future. Right? China is still in a catch-up phase of economic development, so China should be allowed to adopt some industrial policy to promote economic growth and also innovation. In the meantime, we all know in the early stage of economic development, the role of the government is indispensable. Right? So United States has to realize you have to give China some room for economic development.
So you mean mutual understanding in this regard is extremely crucial?
Right. But on the U.S. side, I think China should also realize how big a shock China has created all over the world, not just the United States, but the whole world. But probably the United States in particular, because the U.S. is such a large economy and a large population, the benefits of globalization have not been equally distributed among American population. That has been the cause of the rise of Donald Trump and also the trade war.
Professor Lehman, as a legal scholar, what advice would you give? Earlier, Professor Yao talking about mutual understanding. But based on mutual understanding, can the two countries really do something to smooth out this process, Professor Lehman?
You know, for a year and a half now, the two governments have been talking about 7 different categories of issues, and I think 6 of them are actually fairly straightforward. They involve things like intellectual property rights and technology transfer and exchange rates and the ability of American businesses to operate inside China as easily as Chinese businesses can operate in the United States, the ability of American companies to sell goods to China as easily as Chinese companies can sell goods to the U.S. I think the negotiators on both sides have made a lot of progress on those issues. I don't think they're actually all that difficult. The 7th area of discussion is the hard one, and that's the one that Yao Yang was talking about, the issue of industrial policy. And I think it's important from a legal perspective for the two countries to have a framework where each one can have its own domestic industrial policy as it chooses. Then the two countries can say, to what extent is my industrial policy hurting your country? And if it's hurting, then we can partially decouple. Then we can have limited trade barriers, carefully calibrated trade barriers that will ensure that each country can do its own thing.
Okay.
And then in the rest of activity, they can keep trading. So that's what the lawyers are trying to work out right now. That's what our group was trying to propose.
Well, I know the lawyers are very busy right now, but you know, even the Vice President, Mr. Pence, who has been considered as quite hawkish toward China, have been saying the United States does not want to decouple from China. So why at this moment, among your group, legal experts and economists try to say, well, why don't we decouple? It seems that you are going one step further than the politicians, Professor Zhu.
Well, so there are two extreme views.
No, I don't.
I guess.
I'll come back to you, Professor
Yeah.
Lehman, later, but Professor Zhu right now.
So two extreme views. One is so-called
Yes.
convergence. One is so-called decoupling. Our group actually is looking for the middle grounds, so which actually I call competitive coexistence. So I think the first keyword is the middle ground. I think the second keyword is so-called structural. We need to understand, one, the U.S. and China relations is structural, which means we have areas mutually beneficial. We have areas it's competing. We have areas it's confrontation. And also, the world is structural. The U.S., it's the world GDP 24%. China is only 16%. Together, only 40%. There's still rest of the world, 60%. Right. So the U.S. and China, the relation in the world also is a structure. So for that regards, so we provide this kind of a competitive existence, which could be practical.
Interesting, but you know that is based on the assumption, Professor Yao. Some would argue. People have been arguing. Now, it is important for the two countries to be able to work together, but the question really is, what's the nature of this trade conflict recently? Is it mainly about two countries sincerely trying to work a way out of what you call strategic coexistence or strategic competition? That's up to interpretation. But some have pointed out it's for pure political purposes, at least temporarily. So without sincere ground for discussion, how and you know, to what extent can advice like what you have just raised to be able to achieve its goal?
Well, I don't think the trade tensions are purely based on politics. I disagree with that. I think that there's some substantial issues, real issues in it. It's not just about face or something like that, right? China
It's not about face, it's about elections.
No, it's about the real things, I think. You know, think about the last round of globalization. China has been one of the largest beneficiaries, right? Probably China is the largest one.
And what is wrong with that?
No, nothing wrong, but on the U.S. side, right, they feel the shock, right? Look at the China's wealth. It has been accumulated in the last 20 years. Of course, this is because of hard work we have done in China. But you have to be mindful of the shocks we send to the rest of the world. Likewise, the United States has to realize China has its own way to go. You cannot force China to converge to the American system. That phase is just finished.
But you know, it's very interesting, Professor Lehman, whether what Professor Yao suggested could be accepted and adopted by the Chinese side is one question, but whether really there is going to be sincere understanding of where China is heading for and how much effort China will be and has been making in order to make things work between China and the United States be really understandable and understood in Washington and appreciated. That's probably one of the biggest things.
Well, I actually think that there is widespread understanding of how hard China has been moving to try to make progress. I think the issue is not so much about intent. I think the issue is about the effects. And I think, as Professor Yao indicated, the effects of the China shock combined with the effects of technological change have meant that any time you expand trade, there are going to be winners and losers in each country. But it's meant that it's been very hard for a number of people, And so the question is, should we take a pause? It's not a politics matter, it's a fairness question. And I think the goal of our work is to try to ensure that those fairness concerns are heard and they're addressed in a very sincere way without cutting off trade. I do appreciate Vice President Pence's reassurance that there is no interest in decoupling. There are other people in Washington who actually speak much more harshly and much more strongly in favor of decoupling than Vice President Pence did last week. And I think it's very important that, as Professor Zhu said, we push for the middle ground.
Of course, it's about listening to the words, but also watching the actions. Sometimes the words match the actions, sometimes it doesn't. So, Professor Zhu, now, how far are we from the academic perspective from there?
Let me give you an example. So you mentioned that there is a political, this kind of environment which becomes the intention, right? But let me give you precisely example. The U.S. and China had this 25% of the tariff increase almost for all trade. However, recently there are withdrawals, there are exemptions for firms, for these sectors and products. The U.S. government withdraw these tariffs, right? So there are a lot of withdrawals. Why? Because for these sectors, let me give you an example, agricultural sectors. Both U.S. and China agree trade would enhance both countries' welfare. So, no, even if there are political differences, even if there are confrontations, but this trade in agricultural sectors, the U.S. would like to export the agriculture sector to China, and China would like to export textile to U.S. It's always there. It's always enhancing countries' the benefits. So, whatever happens, as I mentioned, that it's structural. This comparative advantage sectors is always there. However, within talking these comparative advantage sectors, we also remind us, yes, there are confrontations, military confrontations. So it is more complicated than whether enemy or the ally, this kind of a simple argument.
Besides what's going on between China and the United States, there are also many other things going on many multilateral platforms, meaning that China is interacting with the rest of the world as well, not just the United States. So is the United States as well. And you see the trade between China and the United States sliding down as a result of conflict rather than increasing. And yet the other players, trading players of China, are picking up. So you are going to see a world that is still China and the United States bilateral relations, as crucial as it is, being the dominating topic? Or actually there are new trends already happening as we speak? Professor Lehman, I'll go to you for that, and I'll come back to both of you. Go ahead, Professor Lehman.
Well, I think as the two largest economies in the world, of course, initial focus will be on the U.S. and China and that relationship. In part because both countries have so much to gain from cooperation to the maximum extent possible. You make a good point, though. Of course, you have the EU. Of course, you have Japan. You have other substantial economies that are major trading partners for both China and the United States. And that's why all of us really do believe that in the long run, a multilateral approach, a multilateral framework, one that reflects the WTO's commitments to most favored nation treatment, to national treatment for foreign businesses, is the right approach. We've kind of gotten off track for the reasons that Professor Yao mentioned. Nobody anticipated the technological developments, the move to a digital economy. That's right. And so we need to find a way to get back on track in a multilateral world.
Professor Zhu.
That's a very good question. That comes to my theory, which I call it's a mother-in-law theory of U.S. and China relation.
Do you all have these anecdotes for everything?
Yeah. So let me tell you my story. Yeah. U.S. is the wife and China is the husband. In the family, and the husband and wife quarrel each other, argue each other. But who will decide whether this family will become a happy family or falling apart? It's mother-in-law.
I'm not sure whether I would agree with that.
The mother-in-law,
Go ahead with your analogy.
the key is the mother-in-law will not choose a side, will not choose a side, and mother-in-law will keep certainly some independence. So then my argument is the key about the U.S. and China relation, it probably is European. So European will not choose whether stand on the China side or U.S. side. And neither U.S. and China should ask the rest of the world to choose side. So we should prohibit the multilateral confrontations, the China and the U.S. confrontation just bilateral.
Are you living in the ideal world? What you're saying, mother-in-law theory, I'm not sure it's working.
Let's remember the history. Do not turn this bilateral confrontation to multilateral confrontation.
That is exactly the concern here. Well, you are reminding probably many in China not to forget the history. Whether the history is being remembered from the other end is a big question, Professor Yao. From the United States, for example, about this.
I'm more realistic than Jiandong, I think, in the United States.
Okay, go ahead.
United States is still the dominating economy, dominating power in the world, right? China is an emerging power. China's economy is catching up with the United States. To answer your question, I think if the two largest economies can resolve some emerging issues, that's going to set up a good example for the rest of the world. And also, we have to realize, the production network now is around China and the United States, and also EU, but the dominant is just China. That's the world's factor, right? So if we just break up the U.S.-China relations, that means the whole production network, global-wise, just breaks up. So that's going to have huge ramifications for the whole world. So I believe to resolve bilateral issues first is the right approach. If you want to go to WTO, those multilateral organizations, it's really difficult to solve any problem, right?
What advice would you give every one of you as a well-known scholar about, the chaos, unpredictability, uncertainties both businesses and everyone else in the world are facing right now? Professor Lehman, you want to go first, briefly?
Sure. I think I should confess I am an optimist. Our two countries have benefited enormously from cooperation in the business sector, in the cultural sector, in the economic sector generally. And I think the leaders of both countries recognize that. I think what we need now is positive momentum. And I'm hopeful that this first stage will give us some positive momentum. Of course, the first stage is going to take care of the easy questions. I think it is important for the negotiators to have an approach to address the hardest questions, which are the questions about industrial policy, what are sometimes called the structural questions. Those are questions that are not just U.S.-China. They're also EU-China. They're also Japan-China, for the reasons that have been said before. And I think it's very important that we work on two fronts at the same time. First, we build positive momentum, but at the same time, we also start to find a way through, a way forward with respect to industrial policy.
All right. Professor Zhu, of course, the American perspective as what's considered as the most difficult and the most important may not be necessarily what China sees as the most difficult and the most important. What is your perspective about that?
Be practical. So the middle ground, which we call competitive coexistence, is reachable. So that's what my suggestions. There are a lot of agreements between U.S. and China. And there are some disagreements in U.S. and China. Keep the difference, but let's do what we agree.
Seeking the common ground. Last but not least, Professor Yao.
United States probably needs to send China some signal of releasing some of the restrictions put on Chinese investment in the United States. China has opened up the market. China has begun to import a lot of U.S. products. But if the United States keep, say, entity list and also restriction on Chinese technology produced in U.S. like Huawei's laboratory in Silicon Valley, that's not going to increase our confidence.
good gestures, very important for both sides at this moment particularly. Thank you so much for joining us, Xu Jiandong, Yao Yang, and Jeffrey Lehman. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Bye for now.